Hey there, everybody, it's me, your buddy Dave, the host here at the Dark Stuff channel on YouTube. Thanks a lot for checking out my newest video. This week, I'm joined by a very special guest. This is somebody that I have known for over 30 years. Maria Elena Buszek is a professor of art history at the University of Colorado. She's a published author, most notably of the book Pinup Girls, Feminism, Sexuality, and Popular Culture. And most importantly to my viewers, she is a record collector and a huge music fan. So Maria and I go way back to the heady days of the early 90s Omaha, Nebraska music scene. We met while she was working in an old record store called Dirt Cheap, rest in peace. Back then, Maria barely had a spare moment. In addition to going to college and working at a record store and acting in plays, Maria also DJ'd at Omaha's underground radio station, KRCK. So being involved in both radio and record stores allowed Maria the opportunity to meet and or hang out with a number of rock stars in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I wanted to talk to Maria about those days and some of the famous people that she met back then. Now, among those famous rock stars from the glory days of alternative music that both Maria and I spent time with was the Replacements. And in fact, there's a rather infamous photograph of a very, very intoxicated Paul Westerberg back in 1989 that features both Maria and I in the photo. And this was taken a full 2 years before we ever even met. So you better believe we'll be getting to the bottom of that photo as well as numerous others that we both share. This was like a really fun discussion, and it gives just a little bit of a window into what the scene was like back then. In addition to the Replacements, we also share our stories and photos from meeting Nirvana, Elvis Costello, Pearl Jam, Faith No More, Mr. Bungle, and Kiss. So make sure to watch all the way until the end. And as always, thanks for watching, friends. If you guys watched my David Bowie video that I did a couple weeks ago about the Let's Dance at 40, I did pull in a quote from Maria, which I tried paraphrasing just on the fly. And when I watched it back, realized my paraphrasing was not at all accurate. So I just plastered the quote on the over the screen because it actually made much more sense that way.
Fixed it in post.
Yeah, I fixed it in post. So when we were doing that, kind of came up with this idea of, hey, maybe we should do this video. And we both have this history in Omaha, late 80s, early 90s, in the music record store community. And thought that would be a good way of, or a good video topic to go into. Now, we both have a history, like I said, in that world. And we've met a lot of bands and hung out, and it's such a different experience back then in the 1980s and in the 1990s than it is today in the era of the paid meet and greet. And anybody with a little extra dough can go backstage. And it's not even like mega bands like Motley Crue and Taylor Swift doing stuff like that. It's down at the club level. Like you buy a ticket for $20 to see some new band playing in a 300-seat place for an extra $50, then you can go early and hang out in. So it's a different world. I had this crude expression that I used on another video that says that back in the 80s, to get backstage, you either had to know somebody or blow somebody. And those were your two options in that era. And fortunately, both of us knew people, so we didn't have to resort to the other one. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about with Maria was an infamous photo that was taken with myself and Paul Westerberg from 1989, Peony Park Ballroom, May 25th, 1989. I remember it not quite like it was yesterday, but it was an infamous day.
I was a senior in high school. Did we both graduate in 89?
Yeah. I was a senior too, and I feel like I was almost done. I had gotten backstage for the Replacements because I was the editor of the school newspaper, and I wrote a big piece on Don't Tell a Soul and gave it huge coverage in the paper.
When I was working at KRCK, which is how how I was back there is that I was working at KRCK, which at the time was, so it started as a pirate radio station in Dundee. Paul Kriegler, who was a UNO student, basically started pirating, at the time they called alternative music
Right.
in the mid 80s out of his parents' basement. And, and then the FCC would send someone to bust him, and then he'd break it down and start in someone else's basement. And I'd heard about this, and I was working in record stores. I was working at Pickles at the time. And I wanted in. Like, this sounded awesome. And so I basically hounded them. Somehow I got the phone number, and I hounded them until they gave me like the worst show. They basically said, okay, well, you can have a shift. At the time, it was just it's like a bunch of UNO communications and broadcasting students, and then I'm like a junior in high school, and the only woman like on the scene at the time. And I think Steve Sheehan, who worked at Dirt Cheap at the time, had a show, but that was basically it. And they said, okay, well, we've got this sort of thing with, I guess I can call it a scam because they don't exist anymore. Yeah. We've got this sort of scam with Dr. Demento, where Dr. Demento sends us their records. We play them at like 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. We do the Dr. Demento show. They basically pay us to do this, and then we sell the vinyl to like Dr. Demento collectors, make more money. And then if you do that, you can have a 2-hour show from 10 to 12. So that's how I kind of blogged my way into a shift at KRCK. And, and I really just did, I love music and loved radio. Like, I grew up in Detroit. I moved to Omaha right before I started high school. And they had amazing college radio out of Wayne State University in Detroit, where I discovered everybody, like Elvis Costello, The Clash, like all these bands that I still love now. So anyhow, so KRCK was great because it's like brought these things together I loved, and then I got into shows free. And then usually when you pick up your tickets because you were press, they just have a backstage pass waiting for you. And so that was the deal with the replacements.
Nice. So, okay. So going into that show, we're both in high school, don't know each other yet because you said Pickles, and I used to go to Pickles, but I don't really have any recollection of seeing you there. So, we do the show, and here's what happened. So the concert goes on. It's the Replacements. That was their drinking days. I guess that was their entire career, was the drinking days. They were kind of loaded. The show happens. We go backstage. Now, I had that 8x10 press photo and a couple other things I was hoping to get signed. And I walked around to each of the guys who were just kind of holding court with different people and such. And I go to Slim. He signs my photo. He takes a picture with me. I find Chris Mars. He signs my photo, takes a picture with me. I find Tommy Stinson. Right as the second about to take the photo, he leans over and like kisses me in the photo. And so that starts a trend. And I have others where we did it again in the future, where I showed him the photo and then we kind of recreated it. So then I get to Westerberg. Okay. And he was sitting there holding court with a bunch of girls sitting around him. And I go up to him and I ask him if he'll sign my photo. And he takes it and he looks at it and he's like, "Where did you get this?" And I'm like, in the mail, like, what do you mean? Where'd I get this? And he just rips it up into a bunch of pieces and just throws it. Okay. And I'm like, what the fuck, dude? Like, this guy's like one of my favorite, next to Kiss, of course. But I mean, and I'm just like, what the fuck is going on now? He must have seen the look on my face or something, because he kind of changed course after that. And then he goes, "What else you got?" And I'm like, I don't know if I want to give him anything else because he may destroy it, And I had that Musician magazine with them on the front cover. And I'm like, well, I have this. And he takes it. And I'm like, he's going to rip it up. I just know this is what's going to happen. But he didn't. Instead, he opened it, signed his name on like 10 different pages, none of them where he was at or the band or anything, just random pages, gives it back to me. And then I chatted with him for a couple minutes. I mean, you know, like it didn't even happen, you know. And at some point, I asked him if I could take the photo. So I kind of circled back because I was standing facing him at the time. So I walk around behind him, take the picture, and that's where you enter the scene of coming in behind me, giving the peace sign. Fast forward to, I don't know, a year or two later, you're working at Dirt Cheap. You and I become friends. And at some point, yeah, this revelation of you being in the photo comes up, and you were like, yeah, sorry that I kind of photobombed your picture, or I don't know if we didn't use those terms back then, but that you kind of ruined the picture. I was like, I didn't think you ruined it. I thought it was funny, you know. So it wasn't any big deal. I'm just wondering about if you have any recollection of that night, because the reason why I ask is I've had that story of Westerberg ripping up my photo repeated back to me twice, at least, by people who were there and witnessed it, didn't realize that was me, that I was the one who had that happen to. And they're like, you should have seen that kid's face. And I'm like, yeah, I was that kid. Like, I know it was my face. So I'm just wondering about your recollection of that evening, or if you remember any of that, because you are in the infamous photo.
Yeah, no, I remember bringing a poster for Don't Tell a Soul, which I must have gotten at Pickles. Um, I had to have had the album, which I wasn't crazy about, but you know, big poster, fancier. So I brought the poster to get signed, and um, what I remember most is, because I'm 16, no, 17, because I'm a senior at this point. And so, like, Tommy Stinson's like 3 years older than us at this point, 4 years older than us. And he just sort of seemed psyched to be talking to girls his age who were kind of hanging around, whatever. And so he's like, oh, what you got there? I said, I got a poster. And so we start chatting, and he signs it. And I can't remember if I had like a gold. I never had gold Sharpies. Someone else who was not me had to have brought a fancy Sharpie. And he signed it like Tommy plus Paul plus Maria, like cute, kind of, yearbook photo sort of signing. And at some point, I ambled over to Westerberg, and he's like, oh, yeah, Tommy signed that real cute, huh? And so then he signs it with no love for Maria, Paul Westerberg. So he was obviously in a mood in Omaha.
So that night was pretty wild, and it was my first and really only negative experience with any kind of rock star. Like, I just never had that happen in any way. Everyone was always super nice prior to that, and it didn't make me not like Paul Westerberg. Obviously, here we are 30 plus years later, and I still love the Replacements, and I kind of don't care. It is more a funny story now than something that was just like, holy shit. And when you read that, I don't know if you read the Trouble Boys book on them that Bob Mayer wrote. Fantastic book. You really always like that with everybody. And what the writer cued in on really well was the more of like a fan you were and kind of geeky about it, that's the more the person he wanted to pick on more. So, which is so, I don't understand the psychology of that, but
yeah, it was this way to kind of like undermine whatever myths people were building around him that were like making him freaked out or insecure or whatever seems to be
I definitely experienced it firsthand, and it's too bad because I really wish I had that photo, because that was a good photo, and I already had it. The three of them sign it. I just needed Westerberg to sign it, and it didn't happen. This Replacements things happen, and okay, so about 2 years later, we become friends. I meet you at Dirt Cheap, and to still stay with the Replacements for 1 second, I remember when we first started hanging out, trading records and such. I feel like you traded me some Replacements records, and I was kind of like, why would you get rid of these? Like, I started going in my mind going, maybe something bad happened that night. And she's like, fuck the Replacements. Like, I'm done with these losers. And that's why you were willing to trade them. And I was always like, I meant to ask about it, but then it was like, nah, I don't know. Maybe it's just like she just doesn't care. But I always thought that, because I was like, you know what? He was out of control that night. Maybe he was a real dick to her too. Maybe he got handsy. Maybe he did something gross. You just don't know. And it's like, I'm getting rid of this loser's records. I didn't know if that was I never asked you about that, but
It's funny, like amazingly, in all my years at KRCK, doing these like meet and greets and interviewing bands at the station, um, no one was ever handsy. Like everyone was super respectful. And I don't know if it was because I was just so young and they were like, yeah.
yeah.
But everybody was really respectful. I mean, I also, and this was just something that as someone who started collecting records when she was like 9, because my dad's a record collector, and I just kind of grew up in that scene. I knew from the time I was like 10 that I had to know twice as much as any dude to be considered half as smart. So I came to every single interview like to hear with homework. It was Pearl Jam.
Okay.
Their first album was so new that we hadn't even listened to it yet at KRCK when they came with the Chili Peppers, when they opened, speaking of Peony Park Ballroom, when they opened for the Chili Peppers. So I couldn't do any homework. And so we just had them do a guest DJ set, which we never did. And it was just sheer desperation on our part. And it wound up being awesome and a lot of fun. Right. Well, and that's a part 2, actually, because when they came the first time, I didn't have a camera. Eddie Vedder had his Polaroid and he was taking pictures, and he told us it was because it was their first ever like radio, like out of town radio gig ever. And so somewhere he's got a picture of me at the board doing this guest DJ set with them. But the one that you're seeing is from when they came back like a year later. And they were headlining at Ranch Bowl, so like teeny tiny venue. And it wasn't even a meet and greet. I was bowling. So you can see that the photos out in the bowling alley.
Yeah.
And Vedder came out and saw me and came running over and was like, "You're the girl from the Omaha radio station," and handed someone else the camera and said, "Can you get a picture of us?" And I'm like, so I'm looking a little dazed in the photo because I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. And then he signed it and gave me the photo and was like, that was just the best experience and we had so much fun. And so that's how that photo came about. But it was after I first met him for that guest DJ thing.
Well, my Eddie Vedder experience also, he was very, very nice. But like you said, when Pearl Jam first came around on that tour opening for the Chili Peppers, their album had been out a few months. They were nobodies, and they were the first of 3. And my friend Matt Larson and I went down to that show.
Matt Larson, a friend of mine too.
Yes, and we were both big Mother Love Bone fans. Okay, we liked that band and kind of had a chip on our shoulder about Pearl Jam and didn't give a shit at the time. Like so much so that we were almost like contemptuous of Eddie Vedder for some dumb reason. I don't know why. I like Pearl Jam. I have nothing against them. But at that time, I kind of was like, fuck him. Like he's the new, I mean,
right? Or 20, you have all the prejudices of, and the hubris of a child.
Exactly. So if you remember at Peony Park Ballroom, out in the parking lot, that's where the tour buses would be. The entrance was kind of over here, but then the tour buses were on the other side. So Matt and I were walking around and we see Eddie Vedder just walking around by himself. And we're just like, oh, okay, cool. So we go up to him and we're like, hey man, we're both big Mother Love Bone fans. Do you think that you could go on the bus and maybe find like Jeff or Stone or one of the guys that was in the band? And because we want to talk to him, and he actually
one of the guys we care about.
Right.
That's great.
Because we don't give a shit about you, Mr. New Guy. And he was like, yeah, okay. So he goes back on the bus, just, running errands for us, goes back on the bus, comes out with Jeff Ament, and he has 2 little cassette singles in his hand for Pearl Jam Alive. And he gives one to each, me and Matt, and is just like, hey, thanks for liking the band and whatever. And here's the new band. And he was really nice, but Vedder took off. And that was my experience because we so didn't give a shit. Now, he's one of the biggest rock stars of the last 30 years. And we were just like, can you just go fetch somebody else for us? So I thought that was pretty funny. But in keeping with like, he's such a normal, just nice person, even as he progressively got more famous. So, I moved to Seattle in 92, and I would see some of those artists out at shows and stuff sometimes, not very often. Never saw Chris Cornell, never saw some of the major guys, but I do remember seeing him at a Fire Hose show. And the reason why this was significant was because, there was all this drama back in that time about who's a real alternative artist, who's like fake, who's a poser.
Who's a Johnny come lately.
Right. Yeah. And there was a lot of that drama about Pearl Jam at that time. And I got it. They didn't sound like a punk band. They sounded like a 70s rock band. And so it was a different thing. Mike Watt was interviewed in the Alt Weekly up in Seattle, I think was the Rocket or whatever. And he made some kind of vague references to sort of a rock star and kind of a poser. And I assumed, based on the context of his quote, he was talking about Eddie Vedder and was specifically making fun of Pearl Jam. So I'm at this Fire Hose gig, and Vedder sidles up next to me, and he's standing there watching the show with me. I mean, not, we're not talking or anything, but he's right there. And we're right up at the front, and I know Mike Watt can see him. Okay, there's no way he doesn't see him. And I thought maybe he was going to make a comment. There was going to be some drama, the whole thing. Turns out it was nothing. And I don't even think he was talking about Eddie Vedder. And Vedder ended up playing in Mike Watt's band, and at some point. But it was just so weird because I felt nervous for him. I'm sitting there going, oh, I hope Mike Watt doesn't say anything to like be a dick to this guy, because he doesn't seem like a bad.
Mike Watt also like the biggest sweetheart in like music history. So I would have been surprised if he'd have been starting some beef.
Well, and the funny thing is, I always thought there were certain things that were like drama with Mike Watt, like that song for the singer of REM. I was told that was him sort of dissing Michael Stipe. And then I found out later, no, it wasn't. It was a song. He heard Michael Stipe was making a solo album back then, and he wrote a song, and it was for the singer of REM. Literally, that's what he wrote it for. That was why the title was there. And I'm like, oh, he's rhyming it like REM, and he's kind of making fun of them and talking about how it sounds like they're saying something deep, but they're really not. And it was just made up bullshit. I mean, it was
you thinking Mike Watt was saying something really deep.
Right.
And he wasn't.
And he wasn't. It wasn't. He wasn't saying anything deep on that one. When you and I met back in the early 90s, I took away from that meeting that you're a big Elvis Costello fan and David Bowie. And the Elvis Costello thing, I really wasn't that much at the time. I was getting into it, but I held a prejudice against Elvis Costello for the dumbest fucking reason in the world. And that was
David Lee Roth.
That the reason critics like Elvis Costello more than they like Van Halen is because they all look like Elvis Costello or something to that effect. And I took that to heart. I was like, yeah, fuck these critics and fuck Elvis Costello and all of this.
Growing up in Detroit, like you said, we had good radio. We had, a lot of like R&B and soul stations, which is how I discovered hip hop and Prince and, a lot of kind of that end of the spectrum. But then they had this college radio station, which is where I discovered a lot of great music, including Elvis Costello. And I was really little, and you just kind of dial in, and they were playing, it was new wave at the time, right?
Right.
And so they would play that. That was sort of their bag. And I remember hearing "I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea." That was the first Elvis Costello song I ever heard. And it was like it like rewired my brain. But yeah, so Costello was someone who I've been listening to and collecting since I was a kid, like little kid. But unfortunately, I didn't get to see him until '91, which was the Mighty Like a Rose tour. Not his best album.
His rabbinical period.
Yes. And I got the photos to prove it.
Yes.
But no, so not his necessarily his best or most beloved album, but he was touring with Mark Ribot.
Okay.
So I was psyched about that because I was a huge Lounge Lizards fan, and he had just released his first solo album, Rootless Cosmopolitans. But this was back in the day where like there was no internet. Like you barely knew someone was on tour. You had to like get on a phone and call people to figure out if they were coming anywhere near you, and then sort out how to get tickets.
Oh yeah.
So I didn't know Ribot was in the band until the show started. And then I was just kicking myself because Renee, so my best girlfriend, Renee Ledesma from Dirt Cheap, she was also a huge Costello fan. And we took like a week off to go see him, do a bunch of dates around the Midwest. And Renee, so Renee, I think at that point may have been working at KRCK. But unlike me, she was all elbows in those backstage situations. Like I would get real like I won't say get shy, but I would get very like self conscious. Like, oh, I don't want to come on too strong, or I don't want to look like a groupie and like
Hmm.
so I was always like hanging back in those kinds of situations. And Renee was the exact opposite. Like she was all elbows. And that was exactly what she did with Elvis Costello, where we like following this tour around. We couldn't get backstage, like couldn't get anybody's ear. And then our last night of our tour was in Chicago, and we had brought these crates, like milk crates of records and posters and magazines to get signed. Because Renee was like, "We're doing this. We're getting this. We're meeting them." And we bring our milk crates up to like where unloading is happening and stuff. And it was just these like bouncers who took pity on us, and they're like, "Listen, we'll leave some passes for you guys. You can go." And but the shocker was that there was like zero meet and greet afterwards. It was us and Costello and his band, and that was it. So
That
we
was
had
it.
them all to ourselves. And if you look in the background of that tour's photo with me, and it's funny because Renee did the first photo where she brought a camera. Like, it didn't occur to me to bring a camera. Renee had brought a camera, and she thrust the camera in my hand and goes, "You got to take a picture." I'm like, "Yeah, of course." And I sort of back up and I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to take this picture of the two of them. And she rushes up and just gives him that hug that she's given him in the picture. And I'm like, oh, that's an option. If you look in the background of my photo, you can see that there's like a table behind us and a chair behind us with like LPs and 7 inches and magazine covers and posters just spread out. And he sat down and he signed every stitch of it, all of it. And with like running commentary, like there were a few things we brought. We were like, well, we don't know if this is legit or bootleg or not. And he was like, bootleg, signed it anyway. Like, and again, I think it was just we were just these goofy, starstruck kids. We're the only people there. And they took pity on us, and I cornered Mark Ribot, who sort of floated past, and was like rattling off the bona fides, like, "Oh my God, if I knew you on this tour, I'd about," and start naming these off. He's like, "Yeah, chill, thanks, okay." But I think I might have sent you a photo where we got back to our hotel room at like 1 a.m. and just spread out our stuff on one of these shitty
Yeah,
hotel beds and just pictures
that's
practically
awesome, man.
rolling around in it because it was just like we just couldn't even believe that we pulled it off.
That's awesome. Okay, so then that was 1991,
Yes,
right? But you
yes,
you needed to get you wanted to get every one of the attractions, which conveniently they did get back together a couple years later.
they did, but we didn't know that at the time because
Of course, there's no
Bruce
internet back
Thomas.
then.
Well, no, but Bruce Thomas. No, no, no. Everyone just thought it's never going to happen because it's like the attractions were kind of not liking each other and doing other stuff, and then Bruce Thomas wrote this nasty book that was like a novel, but it really wasn't a novel
Right.
about being in a band and the lead singer is a jerk and an egomaniac and a bully. And, of course, no names named kind of thing. But everyone thought, oh, this is it. Like, they are definitely never getting back together again. So, and one of the things that I brought to sign was this picture disc it's like kind of a cool Costello rarity where when they were trying to break him in the States, they did this promo picture disc, and one side was like cuts from the first album, My Aim Is True, and then the second side was cuts from the second album, This Year's Model. And so they had
Okay.
like graphics from each album on each side. So Costello signed it for me on that 91 tour. And then maybe a year later, Renee went to see Squeeze in Minneapolis
Okay.
and came back and said, "Oh my God, it's Squeeze plus the Attractions. It's Pete Thomas on drums and Steve Naive on keyboards." And we're like, "What?"
Yeah.
So they were
They
playing
were
the next
backing
night.
Squeeze. They were backing Squeeze.
Yes.
Okay.
And well, it was kind of like, I think it was just like Glenn Tilbrook and half the Attractions kind of thing. It was
Okay.
like a very shambolic version of Squeeze. No Chris Difford.
Oh wow.
And they were just playing a bar in Kansas City the next night. And so I'm like, oh my God, I can get Steve Naive's and Pete Thomas's signatures on this picture disc. So we drive to Kansas City and I bring my picture disc and we go to the show and there's no Steve Naive. And we're like, what's even going on? So afterwards, we hang out. We like wait for them, and Pete Thomas and Glenn Tilbrook were like psyched because they're just like, oh my God, like cute girls, do you have a car? Let's go! And we took them driving around Kansas City and got Pete to sign it, and then he's like, oh, last night we got a little sauce, and Steve tried to jump over a couch, not realizing there was a table on the other side of it, and broke his arm.
Oh.
And so, no Steve Knight signature for me that night. But then, as you point out, two years about after that, they did indeed get together and toured, and I brought my picture to. So it took me like 3 years to get all four of their signatures, but it
Nice.
happened. Again, Renee elbowed her way backstage in Chicago. Actually, it was the same security guys, and they recognized us.
Really?
And yes, but at that one there was like a real formal meet and greet, and you can kind of see that in the pictures that it's like there's a backdrop, and but yeah, there's a hilarious photo of me where I get my last signature, like Steve Nice just signed it, and you can see I'm like, oh, like I turn into my 9-year-old self with sort of the ultimate prize. So yeah, so that's the thing. Like, if my house caught on fire, that is the thing
That's the
that I
one
would.
record you're gonna grab.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So okay, let's move to the next one. I wanted to talk about your Nirvana photo.
Well, it was just another KRCK thing where it was the photo was taken when they played the student union at KU. So like this is right before Nevermind just blew up. And they like I missed them when they played the lift ticket when they came for Bleach.
Right.
And so I was just really eager to see him because I loved everything that they put out, Bleach and the singles, and then Nevermind came out. And I mean, we forget, like, now it's like canon, right? It's almost like classic rock canon. We forget how shocking and like awesome that album was when it
Well,
dropped.
my story is I worked at a record store in 1991 when that single came out, the exclusive company in Madison, rest in peace. The chain doesn't exist anymore. And I remember the CD single for Smells Like Teen Spirit coming in. And my boss, Liz, was a big Nirvana fan, and she threw it on. And we were just like, the second the song kicks in with the drums, and you're just like sitting there slack jawed. We couldn't even work after that. We played it like 5 times in a row. You just don't have a reaction to that way for anything.
No, and it's funny because the first time I heard it, same thing, CD single. We got an advanced copy at KRCK, and he's in the photo, Tony Bezos, who at
Yeah, the
that time,
photo with Tony, that does Tony, yeah.
so he had taken over KRCK. Paul sort of went into like legit radio, and Tony kind of took over the franchise, right? I wouldn't have that photo if Tony hadn't been there with a camera
Nice.
because it wouldn't have even occurred to me. And he was just really good about like, oh, if someone came to KRCK for an in-store, an interview, he would photograph it. Like, it's like what radio station managers do. And then you would send it to like the radio magazines and be like, oh, these, here's these scrubs from Omaha, Nebraska with like Chuck D or whatever. But that's the only reason I've got it. And the first time I heard it, he had held onto it and brought it home, and then was like, "All right, if you want to hear this, like first listen, come over." And I went to Tony's apartment, and the exact same thing. We were all just like,
Now, who in the photo? I'm looking at it. I see the three Nirvana guys. There's Renee. There's you. There's Tony in the pink t-shirt. Who's the other person in the corner?
Jesse. Jesse, I think may still be in radio. He left Omaha, but he was a KRCK guy as
Okay.
well. He was kind of one of the he at that point we'd already cycled out like a couple generations of DJs, and there weren't a lot of us who had been left over from the basement days. Like something I credit Tony with is he was kind of serious about wanting to get us out of basements and get
Yeah.
us into some
Well,
proper
when was that when it
proper
was on
studios.
Cox? Was that when it switched to Cox Cable or whatever? It was on
Yes,
some.
is
Yeah.
that back then it was like it was a cable station, which now it's like, you flip through cable and you see 40,000 music stations, but back then it was basically us.
What's the magic here? Why
I
can't I
know, it
find
was
it?
so cutting edge. You had to splice your cable basically. That was it. Like and everybody I knew who got the station just did it illegally. It was like not paying for it. They figured out how to splice it into their receiver and get all these stations. But
Well, so I too had a brief Kurt Cobain story or Nirvana story. No pictures of this one. Now, like I said, when I was in Seattle, I used to sometimes see some of the guys, just out and about at record stores or at shows mostly. And I did see Kurt and Courtney together at a Sebadoh show, probably 92, 93 or something. And they just sat in the corner. It was at the Crocodile Cafe. I remember they were in the back. Yeah, they had make one or two friends around them, and everybody just kind of left them alone. It was like you look at them, and it's like, okay, that's Kurt and Courtney. Flash forward to 1993, summer of 93. If you remember what major labels were doing with vinyl at that time, they treated it like a novelty, right?
yeah,
They would sell millions of CDs. They would print up 2,000 copies of the vinyl record, and they didn't give a shit about it so much. They would put it out like 2 weeks in advance.
yeah,
So
yes.
in this case, Nirvana in Utero came out on vinyl, and this was the most hotly anticipated record of the year. What was Nirvana going to do after Nevermind? Where's the follow-up? The whole world has changed, and now, okay, so this was a highly anticipated record. I went over to the record store, and it's been 30 plus years, so I just can't remember the name of it, but I get there. I'm thinking this was August of 93, somewhere around there. I'm not sure exactly when In Utero came out, but it was summertime for sure. And I find In Utero, I go to the checkout line, and there's a couple people ahead of me. And there's a guy about my height with a 3/4 length winter coat in the middle of summer, weird hunting cap with the flaps pushed down and whatever. It's clearly Cobain. Okay. He's there. He's in front of me, and he's holding In Utero in his hand, and he's going to go buy it at the record store. I'm freaking out. I'm just like, what I mean, what is he doing here? What am I supposed to do? Whatever. So I tap him on the shoulder. He turns around, and I'm like, hey, like, don't you get a free one of those? And he just goes, my record company never gives me anything. And then he paid for the record, took it, and walked out. That was the last time I saw him just out, other than at a Nirvana show. But it was just like, wow, what are you doing here buying your own album? I have another Kiss one from 1987, and I wanted to share this one with you because we're both from Omaha, and we both know the significance of this hotel that we're going to talk about. So this is late November 1987, and in that fall of 87, there were so many pop metal, hair metal shows coming to the Civic. It was Whitesnake, it was Def Leppard, it was Aerosmith, it was everybody that was big at that time, including Kiss. Well, the market just couldn't handle all those shows coming in like a 3-month period, and someone got sacrificed, right? The one that got sacrificed was the Kiss show. Nobody showed up. There were like 2,500 people there at the Civic in the main arena. It was an embarrassment. I felt bad for them. Even as a teenager, I was like, this is not good. But before any of that, I had met Kiss on the previous tour. I'd gotten a backstage pass. I have a whole video about it. I'll link to it, whatever. It's a funny video. And that was, I legitimately got to meet them. A few months later, I finagled my way backstage. I pulled a Renee somehow. I was like, I somehow did it, and I got waved back, and I got to go back and talk to Gene Simmons and Eric Carr again. I didn't know how I did that. Well, now it's a few years later, and as you know, every band that played at the Civic back then, or at the Music Hall, or at the Orpheum, or whatever, they stayed at a downtown hotel called the Red Lion. And I met tons of rock stars at the Red Lion, just going there and hanging out the day that they're playing. You just walk around and they're in the lobby, they're in the restaurant. I met John Bon Jovi there one time. I met the guys in the Del Fuegos. They were tripping. They told me they took all this LSD before they went on Z92 and did an interview. I don't know why they were sharing this with me, but they were telling me this.
They were tripping.
Yeah, because they just felt like sharing. We saw Heartbreakers from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and all this. So we knew that was a spot that you go to. So I went down there to try and meet Kiss again. And they stopped us at the front door at the hotel. Like, they had a security person there, and they never used to. It used to be it's able to walk in. And they asked me, "Are you a guest of the hotel?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course." "What floor are you staying on?" I guessed the floor, and I guess I guessed correctly because they let me in where there were some other people outside that weren't allowed in. So I guess, I got in. Again, benefit of looking normal and not looking like a Hessian or whatever was they didn't suspect anything from me. I had a button-down shirt with my Kiss shirt like underneath. So I buttoned it up so they couldn't see.
Incognito.
Right, I was all incognito. I was trying to be like slick about it. And I didn't know if they were going to be there or anything. I mean, I didn't know what was going on. So I'm walking around the hotel. Gene Simmons is sitting there in the restaurant by himself, just eating. So I'm like, fuck it, I'm just going to walk over there. And I did. And someone, like a waitress, tried to stop me. And he's like, "No, it's okay." So I came and sat down. I told him who I was, that we'd met the year before, whatever. He said he remembered. I don't know. He probably didn't. But I sit there and chatting while he's eating lunch. And I was like, "Well, can I do like an interview?" And he's like, "Okay." I didn't have a recording device. I had nothing, because I was 16 and I was just like winging it. So I just tried to memorize everything that he said, which is, you can't do. I sort of scribbled some notes, but I didn't really, I don't remember any of what he said other than when I asked him if he heard the Vinnie Vincent album that had come out a few months earlier. His comment was something to the effect of, "What sort of idiot would allow him to produce an album?" And I was like, okay, I got that one. I never had a bad experience with Gene Simmons. I met him 4 times and he was always nice to me. His public persona is that of an arrogant dickhead, and it's well-deserved, I'm sure, because I know plenty of stories of people that said he's just a complete asshole. He was very nice to me every time that I met him. And I absolutely appreciated that he took the time. Like I wasn't in the real media, I wasn't a groupie. I wasn't like, I was just some 15, 16-year-old kid, and he did enjoy talking. And those were the Kiss lean years, that was before the reunion. I think they were just happy that somebody was interested. The last particular one we're going to talk about that we have some sort of photographic evidence of involves both Maria and I and the band Faith No More. Now, the photos that are going to be up on the screen are from 1990 at the Ranch Bowl, which you mentioned. You addressed the Ranch Bowl before. For those that don't know, it was a bowling alley in Omaha that had 2 bars in it, and one of them was a small rock club that had shows. And any national touring band that wasn't an arena band pretty much played at the Ranch Bowl in the 80s and 90s. That venue was almost everything. I mean, Peony Park, yeah, but it was like everybody played the Ranch Bowl. So I saw Faith No More. I saw them bowling. That's how I got the picture. And I remember asking Mike Patton something about the lyrics to the Real Thing album and if it was like a continuing story. And all I remember him saying was, "You're reading way too much into it." Like, okay,
All right.
it probably was. So then, flash forward, we go to the show. So at some point, you and I become friends, and I find out that you're sort of friendly with Patton. Now, how did you guys meet? Was it similar sort of deal, just at a show, a radio
It
station,
was
or?
bowling at the
Oh,
regional, but after Bungle, it was after the Bungle show there.
oh, okay.
And because I wasn't like the world's biggest Faith No More fan, but I loved Mr. Bungle because I loved John Zorn, right?
Hmm.
I didn't even see the show because at the time I was doing a lot of theater. So I was doing a show, a play. And then I knew Renee and my other roommate, because at that point Renee and I weren't just working at Dirt Cheap together, we were roommates. And then my best friend from high school, Tim McAvoy, also still in Omaha. Him and Renee were at the Bungle show, and so I went to meet them at Ranch Bowl. We just went bowling after the Bungle show, and they were there bowling, and I had my Naked City shirt on, and Patton walked up to me and was like, hey, not every day you see someone like bowling in a Naked City shirt." And so we're talking and nerding out, and then he's like, "We're going to Denny's or Village Inn or something. You guys want to come?" So Renee and I went and had like 1 a.m. breakfast or whatever. And we just became friends through mutual, like, crazy noise jazz stuff. And so we just tape traded. So that's kind of how I got to know him, was that we would tape trade.
Okay.
And then I think the only time I saw Faith No More was when they played Peony. And at that point we already kind of knew each other, and they had like a long day. And so I went and picked him up at Peony, and we went thrift shop and got Mexican food, and then I brought him back, and the rest of the day kind of played out. But that's how I knew him. I actually met him through Bungle, and we were friends through just music nerdiness, and
Okay.
specifically jazz, like not even
No, I remember that
um
Naked City period and when he used to show up at those shows. I did love Faith No More. I found Mr. Bungle almost unlistenable and still do largely. I can't lock in on something. They just jump around too much for me.
that's where David's and my paths
Right.
diverge.
So I did love Faith No More. I loved him with Chuck Mosley. I loved him with Mike Patton. And I talked about this in a video I did called What's in Your Musical DNA. And I was saying how Faith No More is in my musical DNA. And I became such a fan that if you look at the cover of Rolling Stone, when Faith No More was on the cover, Mike Patton is wearing a t-shirt that has the Looney Tunes logo on it, the little swirling logo, and all the characters and stuff. And that was like a famous photo that he was in. I went to like Westroads, Crossroads. I had to find that shirt, and I did. And I used to wear
Every
it.
Spencer's in the tri-state area, David's there.
Yeah, I was checking out every place till I found one. I had the shirt. It was 100% because Mike Patton had the shirt. I was just like, I want to do that. That was then I started pulling off my Dave Perner thing with the ripped jeans and the Chuck Taylor. It was a whole thing back then. I was very able to be influenced by these rock
Well,
stars.
listen, I am always delighted to see men confess to their kind of like sartorial mentors, because as someone who loves fashion history, and I mean at every level, um, and who writes about music, and like I remember speaking a few years back at this at the Mopop conference that used to be at the um, like Museum of Pop Culture, the EMP Music Project in Seattle,
Oh yeah.
being on a panel about fashion, about music and fashion, and we got kind of into this conversation where it makes me real frustrated that I love talking about that stuff and the way that musicians look and dress, even when it's not on purpose. It's totally on purpose, and the
Yeah.
meanings behind that, and how frustrating it is that like you'll run into men who are like, "Oh, that's superficial. That doesn't mean anything about anything." But they will spend 1,000 years talking about Dylan's like Triumph T-shirt and what it meant.
So fast forward to a couple years later, and I moved to Seattle in 1992. And I knew that you were friends with Patton. Faith No More was coming through. This was probably 93. And with Babes in Toyland. And those two bands were
Great live band too. Oh
two
my
of my
god.
favorites in the world at that time. Now I have some Babes in Toyland stories that don't involve photos, but that's for another event.
Another episode.
So I really wanted to go to this show, but more than that, I wanted to go backstage because I wanted to meet all the rest of the guys in Faith No More and Babes, and I really wanted to do that. So I contacted you about it, but I don't know if I sensed maybe you didn't just want to call him out of nowhere and be like, hey, can you do this favor for my friend? So you mentioned the tape trading. So I came up with this angle, or maybe we came up with it together, of you sending me a tape that I was going to give to him. It was like from you, but I was just presenting it, right? Like it was some tape that he wanted or would be interested
in. Like you were my courier.
Right.
Like
and I was
Eddie Vedder getting Stone Gossard out of the van.
Right. And I was the courier, and I thought that's a guaranteed way. If you guys are friends, he'll come out and want to get this tape or whatever. And I think it was like James White and the Blacks. I actually remember specifically what the tape was. I think that's what it was. So you called him up, and this is the story that you relayed to me. So you called him up and mentioned the show, and if your friend could get tickets and passes and stuff, and he's like, okay, what's the name? And you say my name, which is David Leibowitz, and he misheard it as David Lefkowitz. And David Lefkowitz is a rather infamous manager from the San Francisco area. He used to manage like Primus and all these bands, and I guess Mike didn't like him or whatever. And apparently he said something like, David Lefkowitz, that motherfucker can get his own tickets, whatever, thinking it was this Lefkowitz guy. You corrected him.
And I'm like, Leibowitz has this reputation?
Yeah.
What's even happening right now?
So it was a different guy. He wasn't talking about me. So I go down there. I think it was the Moore Theater. And for some reason, we were standing around the back of the theater, and I must have said to somebody, like, I have this tape for Mike Patton. I'm bringing it from a friend of his. And he came out and with these passes for me and stuff. And we're talking for a minute, but, he was kind of weird. And I was also a little bit of a fanboy, and I was awkward talking to him. Like I didn't really know what to say. But we had a mutual friend. And so, that's why we were talking. And he gives me a couple of passes. And this is where I did the ultimate dick move. He gave me like 3, but I had 4 people with me. So I was like, is there any way you could do like one more? And he's like, I don't know. And I'm like, you're the singer, man. I mean, of course you can go get another one. I literally said that to him. I was like, you're the singer. Of course you can. And he actually went in the back and got another one and came back out. Like when he took off, I thought he's being like, fuck you, dude. I mean, and he just was going to take off. He actually came back out with another one. And I was like, okay, he probably only did that because I'm your friend. And he knew that. And otherwise I was like a real asshole.
And you were delivering James White bootlegs.
Yeah. And so I was like, now looking back, I was like, man, what a dick I was. I mean, for even like framing it that way, like, oh, of course you can. You can go do it. You're the singer of Faith No More. And we got to go backstage after the show, and I got to meet all of the guys, and I got autographs from everybody because I didn't get anything signed the first time. And it was a fun experience. I didn't really chat with Patton after that. I mean, it was like, I think he signed my thing at the time, and like that was the extent of it.
I think the theme of this episode is the hubris of youth.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Because now I would be way too self-conscious about it. I would be way too self-conscious to do anything like that. But yeah, when you're young, it's like, who gives a shit? You're just willing to do that. And those old days when you could just kind of hang out by the gate at the backstage thing, and the bands would come by, and sometimes you could go back there, sometimes not. Or the old trick of hanging out by the tour buses, because they always came out after the show. They have to get on the bus at some point, if you're willing to sit there, like they're willing to do it. But yeah, the hubris of youth, like you're just willing to do whatever because you don't give a shit. You feel no embarrassment when you're 20 years old.
Or you've got Renee Ledesma. Like that was my secret weapon.
Everybody, so you made it all the way to the end. Thank you so much for watching. It's much, much appreciated. Hope you dug this one. Please leave a comment, maybe relay some stories. If you've ever met any rock stars or any of the crazy stuff that you had to do when you were young, it would be much appreciated. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.